All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Wilson Center for the Year Ahead in Environment and Energy with the Society of Environmental Journalists, the only North American membership association of professional journalists dedicated to more and better coverage of environmental related issues. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for the study of world affairs, and I'm pleased to announce that just yesterday we were named the #1 U.S. think tank to watch. So thanks to you for watching us. And we have people here in this room and also in our overflow room and many more online. So thanks to you for being here today. I'm Megan Parker. I'm the senior writer editor for the Environmental Change and Security Program. And for the last 20 years, ECSP has examined how environment and population dynamics interact to spur conflict or build peace. And if you watched the State of the Union this week, you know that Climate Security Connection got a pretty big shout out. So we also have some great speakers here today. But before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors on behalf of the Wilson Center. Bloomberg BNA is the leading source of legal, tax, regulatory, and business information for professionals, and you'll be hearing from Bloomberg's Larry Pearl very shortly. Resource Media is a nonprofit strategic communications group that brings diverse partners and unique perspectives to public health and environmental issues and the intersections between these critical challenges. And they recently launched a beautiful website called Women at the Center this year, and Kat Lazaroff is here if you want to learn more about that. Earth Justice, the premier nonprofit environmental law organization, wields the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. The Earth needs a good lawyer, and if you need one, Philip Ellis and his colleagues are here, and you can talk to them. Founded in 1969, the Environmental Law Institute is an internationally recognized nonpartisan research and education center working to strengthen environmental protection by improving law and governance worldwide. And thanks to Brett Kitchen and his colleague Jessica Werber, who are here today. And many thanks as well to my colleagues at those centers, Canada Institute and the Science and Technology Innovation Program, and David Biet and Todd Kukin are here with us. Finally, I'd very much like to thank my co-organizer for today, Carolyn Wetzel of Bloomberg BNA, who is a past president of the board of SCJ, of which I am a proud member. And now I'd like to invite our new president, Jeff Burnside, to the stage. Jeff is a senior investigative reporter with Como Television, Seattle's ABC station, and the president of the SCJ Board of Directors. Jeff?
Thank you very much. I'm just as excited to hear from these people as you are, so I'll make it quick, about 120 seconds, I think it is. I believe the result of forums like this play a key role in establishing the national dialogue, and as we all know, national dialogue helps lead to public policy. So that's why your presence here today, and the thousands of you I expect are watching online, is so important. There's another event 2 or 3 times bigger than this that I wanted to tell you about. It's not 2 hours, it's more like 4 days, and it's not one panel, but it's dozens of panels covering a breathtaking number of environmental and energy topics. Every year, this event is not held in DC, but it's held in different places each year around the US where these events are actually unfolding before our eyes. It's the Society of Environmental Journalists National Conference. It brings together hundreds and hundreds of professional journalists who specialize in issues of the environment and energy, all in one place at one time. That's a pretty amazing thing if you think about it. It's for journalists by journalists, but we welcome others to have a presence at those conferences too. Universities, NGOs, companies, scientists, policy experts. There's no better venue, I think, to make an important announcement if you have one to make. At one recent SEJ conference, we counted 5 cabinet secretaries or agency administrators there at the same time. So when you go to sej.org to learn about how you might be able to take part in one of our exciting conferences, you'll also see that in about 20 days or so, we have a birthday to celebrate. Happy anniversary to the Society of Environmental Journalists, our 25th year. All those years ago, a group of top award-winning journalists sent a letter to other journalists across America saying, these issues are too important and we need to form a professional association so that journalists can improve their skills, improve their knowledge, and put all of these issues before the public, because We believe in coverage, we believe in the accuracy of that coverage, and we believe in important context. So on Valentine's Day, 25 years ago, SCJ was formed really with lightning quickness. And since then, how much we have accomplished. I just happen to have a little slide to show you. 25 years of doing these conferences, about 100,000 or more in attendance from all 50 states and dozens of countries. We've tackled more than 900 panels on a whole variety of environmental topics and hundreds more off those panels. We've, for 15 years, been the watchdog for Freedom of Information Act issues. And by the way, we now have 11,400 Twitter followers, not bad, 44,600 tweets. Collectively, our readership, viewership, listenership from all of our members on any given day is in the tens of millions. Tens of millions. So on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Society of Environmental Journalists, I want to welcome you to this important forum. I first want to introduce Larry Pearl. He's the Director of Environmental News at Bloomberg DNA, a leading source of in-depth legal, regulatory, and business news. Pearl previously served as Managing Editor of the company's International Environment Reporter and Energy and Climate Report. Previously, he was the Managing Editor of Pesticide and Chemical Policy at Informa, and a top reporter and editor at Argus Media's Air Daily. Please welcome to the stage Larry Pearl for an overview.
Thank you. I'm sure everyone wants to hear from the terrific panel we have here, so I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief. But I'm going to provide an overview and look at the 2015 outlook for U.S. environmental policy, also talk about some energy issues. Now, when I was thinking of how I wanted to put together this presentation, what I wanted to say, I wanted to avoid just having a basic rundown of issues, air, climate, water, so forth. I wanted to try and put it in somewhat of a larger framework, a larger context. And if you think of U.S. environmental policy, like many other issues, you can think of it as a series of conflicts between Democrats and Republicans in our current environment, the White House, the administration against Congress. NGOs versus industry, federal government versus state government, and sometimes states versus states, state versus local governments as well. Now, there are a number of issues, key issues, which will be part of this ongoing conflict in 2015, including climate regulation, including expanding the scope of the Clean Water Act, and including fracking regulations in the state and local level. Now, this is admittedly a bit of a simplistic view. There's a lot of players in the environmental policy arena. There's a lot of issues that intertwine, but I think it's a good general lens to use. Now, despite much conflict and ongoing conflict in environmental policy and other policy issues, there are potential areas for compromise. They might be few, but there are some. Some examples are chemical policy reform, energy efficiency, coal ash, water infrastructure funding, and funding for brownfield and Superfund cleanups. But perhaps the biggest potential area for environmental cooperation in 2015 is not domestically in the US, but on the international stage. In particular, the meeting in Paris at the end of the year to potentially come to agreement on a global climate accord. Now, there are many steps that have to be taken. There are going to be meetings leading up to that December meeting in Paris. There are some key obstacles that have to be overcome related to the extent of emissions reductions, climate financing, other issues, the legal nature of any accord. But that's certainly one thing to look for in 2015. Now, the Obama administration has a number of key priorities on environmental issues. Some things we'll be pushing hard for in 2015 are climate regulations, in particular rules to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from new and existing power plants. Also rules potentially to reduce methane emissions from the oil and natural gas sector. They're going to be pushing hard on air policy, air pollution, particularly a potential revision to the National Ozone Standard. These are rules which are designed to reduce smog across the country. Also on water issues, there's a move to expand the scope of the Clean Water Act and the waters that will be subject to jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. Now, Republicans are likely to push back on many of these issues. They will use various means to do this. They will use standalone bills. They will use appropriations riders. They will use Congressional Review Act procedures. And the 114th Congress is a couple of weeks old. Republicans are certainly focused on other issues, including banking reform. But energy and environmental issues are certainly at the fore of the agenda and action over the past couple of weeks, with a number of bills on energy, climate, environmental issues coming up. Big one certainly is Keystone. Republicans are pushing hard on that to get that approved. They don't have the votes to override a promised presidential veto, but there's certainly a lot of attention on that. There's other legislation, for example, to prohibit the U.S. from reducing its greenhouse gas emissions until other countries like China, India, and Russia take similar steps. There's also various energy matter legislation, for example, expediting the approval process for LNG exports. Now, there are a number of areas where Republicans in Congress might succeed in trying to push their agenda or achieve their environmental energy policy goals. Some potential areas are slowing down or blocking the waters of the U.S. regulation, the regulation that would expand the scope of the Clean Water Act. Potentially getting more funding for brownfields and Superfund cleanup. Also accelerating the process for approving natural gas exports. Areas where they're less likely to succeed are certainly areas that are high priorities for the Obama administration and for EPA. For example, we talked a little bit about climate regulations, power plant emission reductions, an international climate accord, and also, also revisions to the National Ozone Standard. Now, a key question in all of this is who makes the rules? Federal government, state government, or local government? And this question comes up often in litigation over the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other environmental statutes. In our current policy environment, it's a particularly relevant issue for chemical policy reform. Now, there's a lot of discussion about reforming the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is the main chemical policy legislation in the US. There's been attempts over the past few years to do that. There's a feeling that there's more momentum now than in previous years, and Republicans are saying they think that's a real chance to happen this year. One of the key stumbling blocks is you have a bunch of states and localities that have moved to restrict chemicals, to ban or restrict them, and do you preempt those rules with a new federal law? Obviously, there's different views on the merits of that. Another area where the preemption question is very strong is hydraulic fracturing. There have been a number of steps taken in localities across the country, in Colorado, Texas, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, to ban fracking. And it's a question of does the state have authority, or can local authorities use their zoning and other regulations to limit and ban fracking? In general, industry and Republicans favor federal preemption in the chemical policy arena, but not in the hydraulic fracturing arena. Now, we talked a little bit about White House versus Congress. Another group of stakeholders that are often at loggerheads are industry and NGOs. But they're not always in conflict. There are some areas where they have worked together in the past and may work together in the future, including on fuel efficiency, energy efficiency, green infrastructure, and other issues. That being said, the NGOs and industry groups are not monoliths. There are certainly divisions on each side. If you look at industry, for example, there's divisions on renewable fuels. You have the biofuel producers who are in favor of a strong renewable fuel standard. And you have petroleum refiners who are not in favor of it. Climate change action, you have coal-heavy utilities who tend to be against action or serious action on climate change. And you have a lot of major consumer product companies like Nike and Pepsi and others who are very much in favor of strong action. You have oil exports, which is becoming more of an issue these days with the large rise in U.S. production and the fall in prices. You have oil refiners versus oil suppliers on opposite side of the equations there. On public land use, you have the mining sector, energy sector, which wants to extract materials from public lands, versus the recreational sector, which obviously wants to use the land for other purposes. Now, one of the key, or some of the key battlegrounds in all these conflicts are Congress and the courts. And I won't get much into Congress. We talked a little bit about legislation the Republicans are pushing this year. But one little factoid I pulled out, just some interest, is the Center for Responsive Politics is an NGO that tracks overall spending on lobbying. And these numbers are for overall lobbying spending, not just energy and environmental issues. But they have numbers through the third quarter of 2014. And there's a little over $2.4 billion, according to this group, that has been spent on registered lobbying activities. That is a slight decrease from the same point in 2013. Slight increase from the same point. But more than $260 million lower than the same point in 2010. So there are any number of reasons why it might be declining in general in terms of overall lobbying spending. But certainly a key battleground is the courts, has been and will continue to be. There are a number of key environmental cases that are working their way through the courts. I've listed a few here. Mercury and air toxics. EPA came out with a rule recently to reduce mercury and other air toxic emissions from power plants. The challenge there is from industry, which is contesting whether it was reasonable for EPA to not consider costs when issuing this rule. EPA has said that it expects the rule to cost about $9.6 billion to comply. And there's a question of whether they are required to consider cost. The DC Circuit said they don't, but industry is challenging it. And this is actually a case at the Supreme Court. There are a number of challenges to EPA's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from new and existing power plants. These are separate lawsuits that are going through the courts, basically looking at, does EPA have the authority under the Clean Air Act to issue rules to target these emissions from power plants. You have the air pollution issues, a number of cases. The interstate transport rule is something that is designed to reduce emissions in 28 states to help other states attain national standards for ozone and particulate matter. And there's also challenges with regard to how EPA is applying that rule and whether they're requiring too many reductions in certain states beyond what they are allowed to do under the Clean Air Act. You have other litigation, certainly in water and other areas. In water, a big case in the Second Circuit. The EPA issued a rule last year on cooling water intake structures. This was designed to protect fish and other aquatic life from cooling water intakes from over 1,000 power plants and other industrial facilities. There's challenges going on now from NGOs who contend that the rules aren't strong enough to protect aquatic life and fish. Also in the pesticide arena, there is litigation surrounding pesticide impacts on endangered species. There's also litigation challenging EPA's approval of certain insecticides called neonicotinoids, which some people say are harmful, potentially harmful to bees and other pollinators. So 7 key things to look for in 2015. I've actually mentioned most all of these. US or the EPA plans to issue by midsummer final rules to limit carbon dioxide emissions from new and existing power plants. They plan to issue the rule or the final rule for new power plants this month, but it wanted to issue both sets of rules together, so it's now planning to do it midsummer. The International Climate Accord, potentially accord, but International Climate Meeting in Paris at the end of the year. Possible revisions to the National Ozone Standard. As I mentioned, that's related to trying to reduce smog levels across the country. EPA has issued a proposed revision, but it's out for comment now, and it could either keep the current one or lower it. It's asking for public comment on that. Expanding the scope of the Clean Water Act. This has a lot of attention in the agricultural sector, other sectors, and how far can you go in terms of regulating the waters of the U.S. and putting them under the Clean Water Act. You have chemical policy reform, which I mentioned is something which a lot of people think there's momentum on, but People have thought that previous years, so obviously it remains to be seen whether there'll be actual progress on that. You'll have Republicans continuing to push and promote energy, fossil fuel exports and production, and further efforts at the state and local level to limit hydraulic fracturing. Now, a big unknown, certainly, and this might possibly come up in the discussion, is, oil is certainly falling tremendously from recent highs, and I believe it's in the mid-40s now, and possibly heading to $40 a barrel. And the question is, what is the larger impact of that on renewable energy development, electric vehicles, a whole host of issues. So some say that predictions are a fool's game, but I'm going to make a few fairly innocuous ones. One is that we'll be talking about many of the same issues in 2016. Two is that Republicans will continue to push back on what they consider overly burdensome regulations. In addition to the legislation I listed, there's a lot of bills out there to reform the overall regulatory process, to streamline it, to force agencies to review their rules and look at ones that may have a negative impact on the economy, rules targeting EPA, rules targeting environmental health and safety and other agencies in general. And they'll continue to push on that and say that these regulations are negatively affecting jobs in the economy. And lastly, that environmental stakeholders, from industry to NGOs, from EPA officials to member of Congress, and those who cover them, will be as busy as ever. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the terrific reporting done by Bloomberg BNA's energy and environmental reporters and correspondents who focus on these and many other issues every day. And I'm sure everyone's looking forward to the discussion. I'm looking forward to a very lively conversation with all of you and the rest of the panel. Thank you.
And now I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. And today's discussion will be moderated by Douglas Fisher.
Thank you, Larry, for that great overview. We are blessed here with a truly remarkable panel of journalists. I did a quick check of our aggregation archives in Environmental Health News and the Daily Climate. It's an incomplete record. It's only on news on climate change and environmental health. Still, our small team picked up 209 stories from these journalists who are sitting here. It's a fraction of what they wrote, but it gives you a sense of the level at which they're working. Let me briefly introduce everybody. Neela Banerjee joined Inside Climate News in December as their Washington correspondent. Before that, she spent 4 years as the energy and environment reporter at the LA Times, and she covered global energy, the Iraq War, domestic faith and ethic issues for the New York Times. Lisa Friedman and I first crossed paths when I was a fairly green reporter at the Oakland Tribune, and she ran our Washington bureau. And today she's the deputy editor at ClimateWire, and she is the go-to source for information on the international climate talks and for what climate change means for vulnerable countries worldwide. She's been ClimateWire for 7 years, is that right? It's crazy. Lisa Palmer, yes, there you are, is a freelance journalist and editor based in Maryland, and she's written for Nature Climate Change, Slate, Scientific American. She covers everything from biotech to science education to sustainable agribusiness. And she's also, very important, a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, where she's focusing on how we're going to feed a hot, hungry, and crowded planet. Amy Harder reports on energy policy for the Wall Street Journal. As you can imagine, that is a broad mandate, and Amy's coverage includes everything from congressional legislation to executive branch decisions to lobbying, international policy actions affecting the U.S. And she's been with the Journal since March. Before that, she wrote one great story after another on energy for the National Journal. And Randy Loftus, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but Randy has been with the Dallas Morning News since I was a freshman in college. He joined the paper in 1989, and he's been the environment reporter there ever since. And that, believe it or not, was his third gig. Now, before that, he was at the Miami Herald and a small paper in South Carolina. Over his 30-year career, he has picked up any number of awards, including an Edward J. Meeman Award for Environment Reporting. So let me pick up where Larry left off here, and maybe we could talk a little bit, Randy, about state pushback. Larry asked, whether with the EPA, with its cross-state emissions and the Clean Air Act, is it doing too much? Is it going too far? How are states responding, or where do you think states are going to respond over the next year to some environmental mandates coming from the federal environmental program?
Thanks, Douglas. I think it's important to remember that it was states who got us here in the first place. The Massachusetts case decided by the Supreme Court, of course, established the EPA's authority to regulate carbon in the first place as a pollutant. What's happened is a dozen states went to court in August seeking to stop this thing. The legal argument is the same being used by the Murray Energy, the coal company, and it's a very arcane argument. Some of you may really get excited about this, but the question before the court is going to be whether these plants could be regulated under both Section 112 and Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. Not as exciting as it might be, but the point is, if that challenge succeeds, it's not going to knock carbon off the agenda, but it's going to knock it way into the administration of a new president. So that has a lot of potential to it. There are also going to be states that are going to be seeing an economic opportunity in this. Certainly, if I'm in a state that is in a regional carbon trading program, then I ought to perhaps be thinking about ways to expand into other states that might need a way to buy and sell some carbon. So it might actually expand the markets in that respect. The state pushback, though, is going to be pretty significant, but it's going to be the same players who have been pushing back against numerous other related EPA efforts, and they have not been particularly successful in those so far. They did not block carbon regulation. They did not block the cross-state air pollution rule. Ultimately, those have been affirmed. So they may have their work cut out for them. States at the same time, some of those that are suing are also making their preparations for dealing with these new carbon regulations on existing plants, especially if and when they come into force. So I think probably the smart money is hedging their bets on that.
Thanks. Yeah, let me jump a little bit here and ask about food. And Larry talked a little bit about the EPA and pollinators and pesticides and the neonicotinoids. Lisa, you've done a lot of work on food, and wondering where you see what are the challenges with agriculture and ecosystems and those areas.
Well, I think that right now we'll see a lot of more action and activity around research and interest in how extreme weather events and our environmental health, the health of our soils, and global population growth will continue to affect our interconnections with food and water and energy and the environment. I think the ecosystems, the health of ecosystems will be really important because they're finding that to have healthy amounts of water to be available for irrigation and so on, and for soils to be healthy for the production of food, much of this is all interconnected. And so I think we'll be seeing more people putting those, connecting the dots.
what about like the nutritional quality of food? I mean, I think I can't remember where I saw a story. It was earlier this week about how Generation Z, I don't know where they're going next after Generation Z, but Gen Z is willing to pay more for a nutritional meal, which is trouble for McDonald's, which is suffering. And maybe how does that connect into the nutritional kind of, value of crops and how does that play?
Well, I think, a couple of things on that front. One is that there's been a lot more interest in how the environment, and particularly climate change, will affect the nutritional value of crops. And some good research came out this past year on what those values are. Moving forward, I know that scientists are now working on studying exactly, previously they were looking at the nutritional value of grains and what, how they're declining over with climate change. Now they're looking at the nutritional value of plants and so on, and how that will affect the health of pollinators, for instance. So they're looking at not only human health, but they're looking at animal health as well, and that will be significant for crop production as well.
And then covering all of this, of course, is, as Larry mentioned, the price of oil and energy economics. And Amy, I'm wondering, energy issues, I mean, we're already seeing they're taking center stage. Everyone's talking about the price of oil. But I'm wondering, maybe where do you see $40 oil going? And maybe also, if you could talk a little bit, where do you see, how does, given these economics, what do you do with these so-called transitional fuels and this move to renewables and so forth?
Right. Well, thanks for having me, and happy Friday, everyone. Well, the price of oil is certainly the talk of the town in the industry. It's pretty interesting, actually, from a Washington perspective. Politicians really don't talk that much about low energy prices. And it's interesting because it's sort of casting a bit of a dark cloud over a lot of the Obama administration's fuel efficiency standards, and, the renewable fuel standard has a lot of issues with that. And I think low oil prices and just the plentiful supply of oil in general casts a darker shadow over that. As for my prediction on what oil prices are, I'm going to predict that they're going to stay low through the next year. I'm certainly not an expert economist on this topic, but what it seems like experts are predicting, I think Shell executives said they could be low for the next 2 to 3 years. So I think that's what you're seeing, and it'll be interesting to see when or if politicians will begin to realize that actually low prices are going to be around here for a while, and that might change the policy predictions on a lot of these policies. For example, the State Department's environmental report on the Keystone XL pipeline based a lot of its premises on the basis of $65 to $75 a barrel of oil. It's about half that now. Whether or not that will affect their decision, I think remains to be seen. But it's certainly something that I think is going to make everything more difficult on the renewable side, or the efficiency side. When Secretary Chu said, former Energy Secretary Chu said early on in the Obama administration that we need to have, gasoline prices just as high as they are in Europe. Well, that didn't help him very much politically, but it's an economic fact to say that the higher prices makes for less consumption. And so that's going to be a challenge for the green agenda for sure.
And there are other challenges, to the green agenda. Neil, I'm wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about some of the challenges you see to Obama's and the administration's overall environmental agenda this year, especially from Congress.
Well, I think Larry did a good job in describing the various flashpoints between the administration and Congress, and both sides have spoken about it. Obviously, the Obama administration, was interesting to watch the State of the Union, and Obama, he was very clear that he's going to defend his prerogatives, especially on the climate agenda. And I think a lot of this has to be looked at not just in terms of policy results, right? Whose goals are going to be achieved, but it has to be looked at, goes without saying, in Washington through the lens of 2016. So much of this is not just about stymieing a rule or pushing it forward, as it is setting down markers, right? What did the Republicans stand for? What did the Democrats, from Obama by extension, stand for? And so it was interesting to watch, for example, these amendments that came up on Keystone with the Democrats. McConnell let amendments be introduced, and Senator Schatz from Hawaii put out this amendment on climate change that'll probably be stripped away in conference. It's not going to really mean anything, but there were 5 Republicans who voted with the Democrats to say that man-made climate change is occurring, and I thought that was an interesting thing. So it's the a lot of the activity will obviously come through Environment and Public Works. Senator Inhofe has spelled out what he wants to do. Clean power, the Clean Power Plan is one of the areas. Methane is another. Waters of the U.S. All of the things that you described. But there seems to be a little bit of hesitancy right now about whether they are going to pursue the CRA. They're sort of hedging their bets. They're talking about things that they can actually do together, like the Transportation Initiative. Would they actually, which is a must-pass bill, would they actually stick in some of the goals that they have in stymieing other regulations into a must-pass bill? They don't seem to be as eager now that Congress has started to be talking about that, which I think is kind of interesting. So I feel like the next 2 years are going to be a lot of thrust and parry. That the tactics of each side interest me as much as what as the particular policy and regulatory goals that they're pursuing, and also with the eye towards 2016. That there's this thinking among the Democrats that you cannot be a climate change denier and win in 2016. And I think the Republicans will have a very interesting space to navigate between now and then. And I am very interested in watching what Republicans do. There's been some very interesting things coming out of Congress recently. This vote is one of them. And interesting things happening on the local and state levels, too, where I think people are much more pragmatic about these things. And so to me, the regulatory stuff cannot be divorced from the presidential election and the way the two sides define themselves.
Yeah, that question about where Republicans need to be on, and where Congress maybe needs to be on science is a question I want to come back to in a minute. But we're at the Wilson Center. We need to step overseas. Lisa, where do you see maybe there was lots of talk about Paris in December. Where do you see any insights from the climate talks? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of these bilateral deals we're seeing with U.S., China. Obama's going to India tomorrow. Is he already there?
He leaves Saturday night,
Yeah.
Sunday.
Right. So what may come out of those?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. This is really an honor to be part of this panel. The Super Bowl is around the corner. It's if you care about climate change and international response to climate change, the first 2 weeks of December in Paris, France will be your Super Bowl. And there are, the way I'm looking at it, 3 big areas of things to watch. If this agreement happens, and Larry did a great job of laying the foundation of the maybes here. If this agreement happens, it will be fundamentally different than anything that has existed before in the climate regime. It will, for the first time, bring in all countries. Right now, the Kyoto Protocol, probably a lot of you already know this, creates 2 categories of countries: developed, wealthy countries that have been asked to take mandatory emission cuts, and everybody else who doesn't. This new agreement will possibly bring everybody to the table. Christiana Figueres, the head of the UNFCCC, was speaking yesterday in Davos, and she described it as going from a house with 2 rooms to a house with many rooms, but she didn't finish that analogy. And the way I would finish that analogy is that this house is a mess still, and the contractors are fighting with the electricians, and the homeowners have no idea what they really want this house to look like. And to me, this is, there's a lot of questions about what this agreement, if it unfolds the way many hope, will really look like. At the heart of it, at the heart of every single other question in these negotiations, whether it's legally binding or not, whether it's a treaty, at the heart of every minute of the 32 hours of overtime, I think, that the last negotiating session in Lima went into, is a question of how do you create a fair new system? if you're leaving a system that neatly divides countries into two boxes and entering something else, what does that something else look like? What's fair, not just to US and China and India, but to Vietnam and Turkey and Thailand and all these countries that are just starting to have to think about where they fit in to this new regime. Bilateral deals are going to be a huge part of that. I don't think that you're going to see targets out of this new, out of Obama's trip. Obama will meet with Modi in a historic trip to India. There's a lot of expectation that it will look a lot like, that there will be a climate deal, a lot like the one that was announced with China a couple months ago. One person at the State Department said to me, you know, we were able to keep that quiet for so long that people just assume we have the same thing up our sleeves now, but we really don't. And I tend to believe them for three reasons. I think this will focus a lot more on what the U.S. can do to help India with its clean energy goals, and with Prime Minister Modi's very ambitious solar goals. Number one, the U.S. doesn't have a lot to offer in return right now. It announced its 2025 targets with China, and it's going to have a hard time coming up with more money. So it doesn't have that to offer in return for, you know, a side-by-side announcement of targets with India. I think India, you know, is very sensitive to being seen as being pressured by the United States or any other major country into coughing up targets now. And there's very simply a timing issue. I mean, it's still a young administration. They're doing the groundwork, we're told by a lot of people, on coming up with what these new targets are. But that's definitely going to be something to watch.
What do you think Obama needs to have to go to, or the U.S. side needs to have to show up with in Paris? I mean, it's unlikely we'll get anything out of Congress. We just, you know, do we need more than just some, you know, by now year-old or 13, 14-month-old deal with China? I mean,
that's a great question. Is there something new? I mean, in many ways, I feel like 2014, like last year, was the year of building momentum, and this is the year of getting the work done. Countries will have to, by the end of the first quarter, come up with their targets. They won't have to. Lima left everything vague and pretty voluntary. They are invited to come with their targets, and so one thing the United States will have, you know, the United States will probably be one of the first, if not the first country to unveil its targets formally and show the world how it intends to get to this 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. A lot of people are going to be watching the U.S. very closely to see what information it puts into this. Because everything is voluntary, there's going to be a lot of expectation on the U.S. to set the example for everybody else. The other thing that people are going to be looking very closely at, obviously, is whether these numbers add up to averting catastrophic warming, to keeping global temperatures from rising above the 2-degree threshold, beyond which most scientists say that the impacts of climate change become irreversible. It's probably not going to. And so what happens after that? What, you know, who fills that gap and how?
that's kind of a good segue into this whole that science question of, you know, I mean, I'm wondering, how is the discussion on science, you know, generally going to change, do you think, both, you know, nationally and statewide? Education standards are coming into place for climate science and science in general nationwide. The IPCC is going to get a new chairman this year. I'm wondering how will that discussion about science on all levels, not just climate change, evolve, if it can, in this year?
Well, I think one of the things that people are looking to, people look to the EPA a lot as an arbiter on science, right? So what is going to be coming out in the next few months is the EPA's study on water and oil and gas development's effects on water. You know, there's this whole discussion about, does fracking affect water or not? And so EPA stepped in, I guess, several years ago to be the arbiter of that. And we were told that, you know, something would come out between February and April, and I think it needs to go through a peer review process. What that's going to look like and whether it's going to answer the questions that people seek, that they think that science will bring to this debate, remains unclear. Because it appears that the study is perhaps more circumscribed than maybe environmentalists would like. And so looking to science to solve important questions is unclear. With the neonics and pesticides, you could probably speak to that because that seems to be a flashpoint on science too, right?
I think that for what I'm seeing the science component, that there's also a sense of bringing more people to the table. What does it mean? Or how can better decisions be made on science? And so I'm seeing scientists working in a more interdisciplinary way than ever before. And so by looking at who's working on what issues together, will say a lot. And I think another thing that's be coming out of the next national climate assessment is the last time it was released in May of 2014, I think, there was one chapter on the human health impacts of climate change. Now, I think this time around will be 7 or 8 chapters. That's big. And they're looking at the health impacts, what does it mean, how do pesticides affect health, what are the weed science and affecting asthma and allergy rates, and a host of things, what are airborne illnesses, waterborne illnesses, it goes down the line there. So that's big news, I think.
But I think expecting science to resolve questions, I mean, scientists are not seen by various parties as honest brokers anymore. The science, the messenger is in doubt, right? And as as we're seeing in the discussion around climate change, it's not just about the science; it is who is delivering that message. And that becomes enormously problematic when you're trying to develop policy based on science. It's sort of like, well, I have my science and you have your science. And so that's I think I think it's gotten quite. I mean, there's a sense that that science has gotten clearer on climate change, but where the acceptance is on that in the broader public and certainly among politicians in Washington remains unclear.
I think on that point of climate change and the Senate with these votes this past week, I mean, I think they were quite illuminating to see where the Republican Party is on this issue. Literally minutes before the Senate was to vote on this amendment that Senator Hoeven had written that basically restated part of the Keystone environmental assessment from the State Department. It didn't have a word about climate change in it. At the last minute, some Republican aides literally took Senator Schatz's amendment, which said climate change is real and significantly caused by climate change. They crossed out Schatz's name and put in Hoeven's name, and they crossed out the word significantly. And 15 Republicans, including Senator Rand Paul and Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania and Paul of Kentucky, they voted yes on that. That was 15. Half of them are up for re-election in 2016. And so I think that's significant. It sort of got lost in the shuffle. These votes are symbolic. They won't change the law, even if they became law. But I think that's significant. Of course, now the question that people are asking now, and something that the Congress should have been debating for more than a decade or more, is, yes, okay, this is what the science says. Now what, if anything, should we do about it? I think that's a legitimate debate that the Congress should have, and there are legitimate answers to that question that are very different. But I think that is significant. That said, I don't think this vote is paving the way for anything. I think it's a very slow crawl through the sand. I don't think this Congress is going to do anything on climate change except for try to stop EPA.
Well, in Texas right now, we're seeing an example of the public response to scientific information. Irving, Texas, is a suburb of Dallas. It's in Dallas County. Since about April, there have been approximately 40 earthquakes in Irving. Most of them are very minor, and frankly, the biggest we've had is a 3.6, and people felt that a couple of weeks ago in downtown Dallas, and so that really got people's attention. But we've explored the science a great deal and continue to do so, and when we have the seismologists at Southern Methodist University quoted in the paper as saying that they cannot rule out some connection to fracking or disposal wells, then we get one list of the public telling us those scientists don't know what they're talking about, and then when we have others, we have other quotations in which they say, but we also can't definitively link it to fracking. Then the anti-fracking people go nuts and accuse the scientists and us of having put our thumbs on the scale. So certainly it's correct. Science is not going to resolve these issues, at least not in the public forum. It's really going to be a much tougher political process, hopefully informed by science. But the idea that the public is going to read the science and then make up their minds is simply not borne out by experience.
I think you also had the issue with science and the impacts of air pollution, climate change, and so forth. The issue of, are the impacts immediate? Are the impacts long-term? Are the impacts dispersed over many people? Are they concentrated? Do they affect certain sectors of the economy? And sometimes it's hard to generate action on these issues because the impacts are so widely dispersed and they don't get to some of the core constituencies that have strong lobbying presence in Congress and elsewhere. There are also the issues of some in Congress, even though there are a number of Republicans who are now going on record as saying that humans have an impact on a changing climate. There are still many in Congress, particularly on the Republican side, who just don't see the science as sort of necessitating serious action on the part of the U.S. or other countries. They also look at it in a competitive nature in the sense that why should the U.S. do something if other countries aren't doing it? Now, possibly in Paris, they'll come to an agreement where it'll be an equitable division of responsibility to address this issue, but it's certainly a challenge to get to that point. And even the U.S.-China deal, many people complain that U.S. has pledged to reduce its emissions, I think something like 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, and China is just committing to peak its emissions around 2030 and to have 20% of its energy come from non-fossil sources by the same time. So there's certainly a discrepancy in terms of the level of action that will be required on the part of the two countries to get to that point. And there's a lot of questions of whether the U.S. can even get to that goal that it has enunciated with China. You look at the carbon regulations for power plants, methane emission regulations, other things, and people that my reporters have talked to say they don't see that getting to the 26 to 28% reduction level. So potentially there'll be other sectors to be targeted, but certainly power plants and oil and gas sector are two of the bigger emitters, and obviously the transportation sector as well. But it's a real question of whether the U.S. can even get to that pledge. And obviously we'll see what they propose leading up to Paris in terms of emission reductions that they'll target.
Could I just respond to a couple of things there? One is that what's interested me about the way the administration is kind of like looking for all the coins and the couch cushions, right, to put together this 26 to 28%. I got it, 26%. So is that they've not gone after agriculture, which is the biggest together is the biggest emitter of methane. And watching what's going to happen with ag is very interesting to me. I they are enormously powerful, and nobody touches ag. So I find that very interesting, and I'd like to watch that in the future. The other thing too about acceptance of science, I feel like we're sort of framing it as like somebody reading a scientific study and not agreeing with it, and maybe talking to scientists they know. I think we can't talk about the way politicians react to science without talking about who's actually funding the campaigns of politicians who now sit in Congress, right? There are, I think there are members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are true believers and are skeptical of what 97% of the world's climatologists accept as solid science, but for whatever reasons, but there are so many people who are backed by vested interests, fossil fuel interests, who have a lot to lose if we put a price or a cap on carbon. And I think the interpretation of science by politicians cannot be divorced from who is funding politicians. And I think we as reporters very often do that. Is that we don't talk about, the campaign finance link.
I also think, just one very quick comment, I think climate change has become a religion and is no longer a science, at least in the public realm. And I think that's something that needs to be changed in the debate. You don't say you believe in climate change, you acknowledge climate change science. And that's
Science.
right. And that's something that even though belief fits in a headline better than acknowledge.
I also want to say that there are new people at the table. I'm seeing, just with some of the recent business interests that have been coming to the table. So these are not just the Patagonias of the world or the Ben & Jerry's of the world talking about taking action on issues like the EPA power plant rules, which I think over 200 Ceres. I don't know if Peyton's here, but Peyton Fleming told me that Ceres had gathered some like 220 companies to speak out in support of the EPA power plant rules, and so these are big companies, including one was I can't remember the name of it particularly, but it's an aluminum company based in Georgia, a very large aluminum company, Novelis, and as well as Mars and IKEA, and top big companies in support of this. So I think that we're hearing some new voices at the table that maybe, who knows, there may be a link to the wallets of the politicians with some of them, and whether or not they're now perking up and listening to some of the business interests would be quite interesting for us to follow.
Well, Larry made an important point when he noted that interests are not monolithic on these things. In a number of the states, we're going to find that the traditional coal-powered electric companies are going to be very much against the Clean Power Plan, but the new companies that have come in and spent a lot of money on burning natural gas, building new gas plants, and the expansion of renewables as well creates a new kind of economic interest within that state government. So certainly there are. It used to be pretty easy if you were in a oil or a coal state, you knew how to vote. That may not be the case quite so much anymore because you have, as Lisa said, more people at the table now.
Well, one thing I find particularly interesting is Amy mentioned, other people say that there was this amendment vote related to the Keystone Bill, but Republicans going on record as supporting the notion of humans impacting the climate. But there's a sense that there's not going to be much progress, at least in the near future, on climate change legislation. But you have these core issues and constituencies excuse me, for the Republican Party, which are very in support of action. You have the defense community, the Pentagon, which recognizes that climate change is real and could have major national security implications. You have major corporations, and I mentioned there's some division there, but you have a lot of corporate America saying we need to do something on climate change. You have the whole issue of religious conservatives and the Pope's recent declarations on responsibility for the environment and climate change. And certainly, the religious right is still an important part of the Republican Party. So you have defense, you have religion, you have corporate America, you have all these constituencies who are very much concerned about climate change and in favor of action, but you still have this very slow process in Congress. And my question is, when do we get to that momentum that will be strong enough to actually get Congress to do something and pass legislation and add to the regulatory agenda that the Obama administration is putting forth?
I would say, sorry, really quick question on that. I would say, though, that, there are a lot of companies, a couple of degrees away from being directly regulated by EPA that may support those regulations, particularly because they're a consumer-facing company. But many of the companies that are directly regulated by EPA with this Clean Power Plan do not support the regulation, or they're very cautiously responding to the regulation, and they're not really coming out saying, yes, we support it, yes, we don't. Shell has a built-in carbon price. ExxonMobil does, too. A lot of these companies do not question the science, and they are taking steps within their companies to do things, but they're not out there championing the cause, and they will never do that. That's not what these companies do, and they're not going to come to Washington and tell their lawmakers, hey, you guys need to get on board with these regulations. And I think many of them are critical of what EPA is doing and the pace at which the EPA is doing it, not necessarily questioning that it is doing it, but the pace and the way it is doing it. And then in the absence of individual companies being very vocal on these issues, I've noticed that the trade associations, the American Petroleum Institute, the American Council for Clean Coal Electricity, I think ACE, I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Many of them kind of fill the void in there, and they're very vocally critical of the regulation. And so that's the sort of dynamic you have here. So I do think that there is a very vibrant part of corporate America that does not support the pace at which and the direction EPA is going.
Right, and certainly the structure of the Clean Power Plan has the potential to be very problematic. For years, states have said, look, don't tell us how to do our work, just tell us what the goal is and we'll figure it out. Well, that's pretty much exactly what the EPA has done at this point. They've said, here's your state goal, go figure it out. And they're all saying, no, 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 you have to tell us how to do it. So the states are having to do something they have really not done before, which is to create a whole idea of a regulatory scheme. They've generally patterned each other and copied the feds to one degree or another. This requires a lot more innovative thinking, and a lot of them, I think, are starting to feel some pains out of that process.
I want to open this up for questions, but I just want to pick up one quick thing, Larry, and several of you have mentioned this, about religion and belief and the Pope. And this is the year we're seeing, that there is a papal encyclical that's supposed to coming out in September, I believe. Are we going to see a grassroots movement kind of rising from our churches on this issue? Could this be the year, or is that insignificant?
Well, I don't think that really helps my comment about wanting to make climate change stay in the science sphere with the Pope coming out talking about how important it is to act on climate change. I think, I frankly wouldn't see that as being all that successful. I think a lot of, I just don't see that being something that would actually move the needle on this and could further polarize
No,
the
it's
debate.
not going to happen. I mean, unless he forms like a dark money organization or something in Delaware. But there have been religious groups for a while now, and there are plenty of religious groups that align ideologically with the right, and it's just not part of the equation. And even though polling is showing that a lot of people, including younger Republicans, accept that climate change is happening, the question, getting back to Larry's point, is that is this going to be a litmus test issue? Is this going to be an issue that people vote for and hold their elected officials accountable for? And and what is it going to take for those elected officials to say, okay, I might be primaried on the right by this, but my constituents are suffering so much from climate change that I have to take a stand on this. And how many years away are we from that?
I actually think that you could see some really interesting grassroots movements coming not just from the Pope's, the Pope's moves and the Pope's visit later in the year, but, you saw last year with the summit in New York and the marches around there, a movement of not just young people, not just activists, but religious people and older people and families and people who are coming at this from a business perspective. And I feel like that's growing. I think that, over the years, activists have been much better able to tap into pockets that they weren't able to before, and the Pope is opening up a whole new area for them. I think another really interesting area to watch, as well as religion, and this is an area that I've really been interested in for a long time, is how the environmental community motivates immigrant communities in the United States. I used to be, as you know, a reporter for the Oakland Tribune. One of the what issue binds together Republicans and Democrats in California is the Armenian genocide, because of the large number of the large Armenian community. There are huge pockets of immigrant communities all over the United States that have not been motivated to be active and politically active on issues of climate change. Filipino communities in very Republican areas of Texas, whose homes were obviously, whose families' homes were obviously hit very hard by Haiyan. Vietnamese communities in near Dana Rohrabacher's district, for example, communities that are starting very slowly to be inspired and pushed by environmental groups to act and be activists on the climate issue in a way that they weren't before. That's an interesting area.
So I've also reported a lot on religion and climate and ecology. For Yale Climate Connections, we did a series of reports back in maybe 2 years ago, and we've updated those for YaleClimateConnections.org, which is a radio site that's a 90-second radio show every day. So, but you'll be hearing some of those reports coming up on what the different religions and their perspectives are, what they are communicating to their congregations, because they do have strong perspectives. All of them have some elements of the religion that will be addressing that in the coming year. And yes, it plays off what the Pope's comments were. And as well, if you're a reporter looking for better resources on this, I would look to the people who sort of founded this area study at Yale, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And so you can look up every religion and to see what their positions are on environmental issues.
Can I make a comment on the
Quick one. I want to get to the questions, but yes.
on the social movement? I think the more important social movement to look at is the one that the Keystone XL pipeline movement has grown over the last 6 to 7 years. Forget what the decision is on Keystone. Environmentalists and local environmental groups, local activist groups are delaying pipelines and other types of infrastructure all over the North America, really. And so, President Obama can say this is just one single oil pipeline, but really, it really does tell the story of the U.S. and North American energy boom. And so I think that's something that is resonating with the environmental community, and talking with people there, that's what's building a social movement that they hope will eventually cause to have some sort of change in climate action on a level that is more than just one pipeline.
But just, you're absolutely right, I think, but I think that the connection there is that for a lot of activists, I believe the Keystone movement is the climate movement. I mean, it's much harder to the climate march saw, depending on whose numbers you're using, a couple 100,000 people. But at the end of the day, it is much easier to draw attention and rallies to a physical thing, to a pipeline, against a pipeline, than it is to fight for cutting emissions. And so Keystone is the visual representation of the larger fight, for sure.
Right. Yeah. I agree.
That's very true. And let's open this up for questions. We have two lovely people here with microphones. Speak into the microphone, please. We are being webcast, and your mother would love to hear you. No diatribes, please. No rants, no speeches. There is an overflow room, and we will take questions from them as well. There will be somebody there passing out little note cards. And for the first question, how about the green in the middle, please? The woman.
Hello, thank you. My name is Rudra Kapila. I'm here from the University of Edinburgh. My question's regarding opinions from the panel. Firstly, my understanding was that the EPA regs were designed to foster innovation for the fossil fuel industry in technologies such as carbon capture and storage. Do you envision CCS having a big drive this year? And then I link that to the international arena because CCS was a very big kind of issue for debate in the UN climate negotiations. It was included as part of the Kyoto Protocol under the Clean Development Mechanism. So there is also potential for the US to develop this technology, which, yes, I argue perpetuates the use of fossil fuels to countries like China and other developing countries like Mexico and India. So if there were any comments on that, thank you.
I would say the short answer is no. I don't think anybody outside the administration has, and I've talked about this with a lot of people, including former administration officials inside the Obama White House and administration. None of them think that the EPA rules will drive CCS technology. The officials at EPA and other parts of the administration maintain that it will, but experts at a lot of the companies, Alstom and GE and those, they just don't think there is the incentive enough to drive CCS, especially in the U.S. and especially with cheap natural gas prices.
Yes, there's been an attempt in Texas over the last few years to try to portray the state as the Saudi Arabia of CCS. because we have a lot of salt domes, especially under the Gulf, where you could stick a lot of stuff. But it hasn't gone anywhere yet, and I think there would have to be a much heavier hammer over the carbon-producing sector to make that happen.
On the international level, I mean, you might see fights over whether money from the Green Climate Fund will be allowed to go for something like CCS. But at this point in the debates on the negotiations themselves, on what the Paris Agreement is going to look like, it's not on the radar of the main issues.
It should be noted also that the proposed rule to limit carbon emissions from new power plants is premised strongly on the viability of CCS, and that's part of the legal challenge that's out there in the courts now. There's a provision of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 which says that you can't rely on plants that have received DOE funding for CCS to promulgate these regulations that have been put forth for new power plants. And 3 of the 4 plants which EPA cited as proving that CCS is viable did receive DOE funding. The other one is in Canada. But then EPA came back and said, well, we're not just relying on these plants and these demonstration facilities, but there's all the science that says that CCS is viable. But the issue of CCS and whether it's viable and if EPA has demonstrated that or it has been proven is at the core of the litigation against a rule to reduce emissions from new power plants.
Let's take a look up at the gentleman in the dark suit on the right in the aisle there.
Thank you. Very fascinating panel discussion. Thank you very much for organizing it. I'm Richard Scorza. I'm a member of the board of University Park Community Solar, a for-profit solar generation company which by accident put our first plant on the roof of a church, our local congregation, the Church of the Brethren. So apropos of your discussion on the religious motivation for alternative energy, I can testify that numerous congregations contact us through our website. A number of coalitions, we're in Maryland, of religious-based organizations and church groups contact us for modeling their proposals along the lines of ours. And I'll just say that the catchphrase that many of them use are this term, their responsibility for stewardship of the earth. And I think it's underestimating the grassroots element that small solar projects such as the ones we organize are perhaps a role model for a number of these organizations that are seeking ways to affect their responsibility for
Sir, do you have
mitigating carbon.
a question?
So my question is, do you think the small community scale solar plants such as the ones we put up, like 2 megawatts, and have a future in the overall mix of things that you all are talking about at the global level?
Well, I think one way to look at that is that the choice, the ability to choose renewable energy is something that could possibly be an area for common ground between parties that you would normally think don't have a whole lot to say to each other. And one of the best examples that people have written about is, I think it was either the Sierra Club or other environmental activists in Georgia and the Tea Party there. The Tea Party wasn't so much concerned about climate change as they were about individuals' ability to put up solar panels at their houses if they wanted to. And the Sierra Club saw it as something that could reduce emissions. And I guess the power company there wasn't making it very easy for homeowners to put up solar panels, and they made for strange bedfellows, but I think they were effective bedfellows. I actually think, if memory serves me correctly, some of you may know this better than I do, but it could be, that, and it gets to kind of a bigger point, right? Is that in discussing climate change and what to do about it, are there ways to discuss it that really come at it in a sort of oblique manner and render the same results without actually getting into the fights over the science and the credibility of it? So, for example, the choice of being able to have distributed generation as a way as a homeowner to save money and to have a certain autonomy. Or there was a great story that the New York Times did a few years ago about a town in Kansas where an environmental group went in and they didn't talk about climate change, and they instead appealed to the sort of Midwestern frugality of people, right? And they got them to reduce their power usage. I did a story a few years ago about heat-related deaths among football players, right? And it was in the South. And, these kids they're high school kids, they have 2-a-day practices, start in August, and scientists had tracked, when these deaths occurred, what positions, and so on. And it was, interestingly, in the Southeast, because of humidity, and in the morning, right, when humidity is highest. So the coaches didn't want to talk about climate change, right? But they did say it gets hotter. This was a public health issue, and they found a way to deal with it. There was a statewide approach to cut down on deaths, that every high school had to have certain things in place. So maybe, things like solar or wind or certain public health approaches, get around the discussion of the science and actually go for the effects to either mitigate or adapt.
And I think from the international end, the story of small scale renewables is pretty big and getting bigger. I mean, you have the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative, and you have a lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements. United States, Power Africa. There's obviously Prime Minister Modi has called for a light bulb in every home by, I can't remember the year, but to bring energy access to 300 million people in India alone who don't have it within a decade or two. And small-scale off-grid renewable power is going to be a huge part of that story. There's going to be, I think, as there always is, a tension between whether grid-connected energy best serves area versus off-grid, but you're seeing really interesting initiatives happening in the past few years that you didn't used to see. Just this week, a group of NGOs were asking the president to launch a Power India initiative, a lot like Power Africa, focusing, they would hope, on small-scale renewables.
But that could be a very interesting thing to watch for next year, and maybe could go against one of Larry's predictions, and how the climate, debate morphs in some ways into a debate about health or energy or, small scale kind of stuff. Let's take another question down at the bottom. Frank in the vest.
Frank.
Hi, Frank Masano, Bracewell Giuliani. Obviously, I could ask you guys a million questions about all the subjects we've talked about already, but I think the one that we haven't really talked about much is which I think is probably the biggest issue that we will face over the next year, and it's got a public hearing coming up next Thursday. That's the ozone rule. Obviously, the ozone rule has wide-ranging impacts and across industry sectors, manufacturing, everything. So your thoughts on where the administration, obviously gets us back into the science discussion as well. So your thoughts on the ozone rule, the process that EPA is taking, and where that ends up, and does it get done by the time the president leaves office?
Frank, thanks for that softball. I appreciate that. I will buy everyone in this room and listening online lunch if the administrator does not set it at 65 ppb. If she goes higher or lower, I will be stunned, and I will be bankrupt because I will be buying all of your lunch. One of the debate over these standards is rubber stamped every time there is a new standard. The same interests say the same things. And it is sometimes it's resolved one way and sometimes another. The most interesting thing about this, though, might be that it is leading to what some describe as an assault on the scientific review process, and others described as a much-needed reform of that process. But to make a long story short, we have a provision of the Clean Air Act that requires that a standard for a criteria pollutant be based solely on public health protection. It cannot be based on cost. Supreme Court has upheld that provision twice. That's not in debate anymore about what the existing law says. The question is going to be whether that provision is going to withstand political pressure over the next few years. And I don't know the answer to that. But the argument in favor of having cost only, having rather public health only involved there, is the same as this example that I've heard. If you go to your doctor and ask what's wrong with me, you don't want him saying, well, that depends on how much money you have to spend on treatment. It depends on how good your insurance is. You want a purely health-based answer to that question. If we start mixing cost into the health standard, then perhaps we are violating the intent that the Congress had in the first place. At the same time, the cost of compliance is not trivial, and certainly the lower you go, the more expensive it gets to get there. On the other hand, most industry-backed estimates of the cost of these things always omit the predicted health benefits. And it's something that riles me as a reporter. I want all the facts on the table. I don't want just half the story in front of me. So I think that Frank's right. I think the ozone standard fight is going to be a very tough one. Public comment is open through March 17. The EPA is having two hearings outside Washington, one in Sacramento and one in Arlington, Texas, which is suburban Dallas, next week. The fact that I don't know why they chose California and Texas as their two locations for doing this, but I'm kind of glad they did. But we're certainly going to see by October 1st, when the EPA has promised that a final standard will be out, we're going to see a real arm wrestling match over just how we set these standards and what the definition of the public welfare really is.
And I can imagine the industry is hoping to repeat what happened in Labor Day 2011, was it, or 2010? 11. It was the day after I broke my ankle, so those two memories are cemented in my mind. But I think industry is really mounting a very aggressive campaign against the regulation, against the standard. And I think it's also important to note, because it's something that the EPA administrator has said, is that all of the other regulations that EPA has unrolled over the last couple of years is intertwined with this ozone standard. It will cite, I anticipate, a similar standard that what you said with 65, something on the middle of the road, and they will cite its greenhouse gas regulations, its mercury rule, if it withstands Supreme Court scrutiny, which of course is a wild card, and its cross-state air pollution rule. So everything kind of comes together, and it's easier for the administration to do that now at the end of its administration as opposed to right before President Obama runs for re-election.
There you have it, folks. One of the benefits of coming to this session is a possible chance at free lunch. You said 65 ppm, did you say? It's one fact I'm going to remember for next year. I'm going to take a question from the back, from the overflow. Jeremy Brooks at the U.S. EPA has a good question here for us at the Wilson Center. He writes, India and China have been mentioned extensively, but what about other major developing countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, etc.? What will their issues on deforestation and rapid industrialization take on new relevance?
Sure. Let me step back a second to answer that, because we have mentioned China and India a lot. And so, first of all, one of the things to look for over the next year is what Congress, what Republicans in Congress are going to demand. We saw an amendment last night to the one of the many amendments to Keystone. Senator Blunt put forward an amendment that won a majority of votes, though it failed because it didn't make it to 60 votes, that would have declared invalid the U.S.-China agreement. There's some question about how that would happen, but his assertion in this legislation, and one that you made and that a number of Republicans have made, was, China won't have to do anything for 20 years. Their emissions will grow, and the United States should not agree to anything in Paris that does not see commensurate. I think the words in this particular amendment was I'm blanking on the exact word. It wasn't disproportionate, but the gist is that there should be commensurate emission cuts from India, China, and presumably other major emitters. That is something that is not going to happen. The way that and were something like that to pass, it would obviously be a poison pill in the negotiations. The way that the Obama administration has approached these negotiations is that they very much want to see all countries take equal legal responsibility for cutting emissions, to be held to the same legal standard, while recognizing that countries of different levels of development and wealth will do different things. And so when you ask about what Brazil, what some of these other countries will do, that feeds into the question that's at the very heart of these negotiations, which is, well, how much should they do? How much responsibility should these countries take? There are, is it a formula? Is there a formula out there that all countries can agree to? Some mixture of emissions per capita, historic emissions, future emissions, GDP, that will give us some magic formula about who should do what. It's a carbon budget. It sounds great on paper. You will never get all countries to agree to it. Countries like Brazil have a proposal that they describe as concentric circles of differentiation, which basically takes this idea of two groups of countries, puts it into three groups of countries of different levels of responsibility, and countries would take on more responsibility over time. The United States, the Obama administration's offering to this group of ideas is, they call it self-differentiation. We've called it BYO, bring your own offer. And it is essentially, the United States has essentially said, let's find a way to sidestep this very messy debate that no one is ever going to win, and have everybody bring what they can to the table, back it up with facts, have the monitoring and reviewing be legally mandated, be internationally binding. That then that may win by default, but that brings its own problems, which is, if everything is very bottom up, what if all of these great brings that countries put on the table don't add up to enough to keep temperatures below the 2-degree rise?
But do they, there are people who say that this is kind of the first bite of the apple, the first real bite of the apple, that this is the first step towards that, towards slowing or halting or bending the curve to the 2-degree rise, and that one of the key things would be, in whatever accord or agreement is hammered out, is that you can't backslide. You can't you can't agree to something and then do something weaker later. I mean, do you think that is a viable way to go?
I think that's the second area of stories to watch, actually, which is not just whether you make a great point. So it's not just whether these targets will add up to 2 degrees, but it's, if they don't, will that be right? Is the path more important? There are, plenty of environmental groups that are saying, if this doesn't keep temperatures below 2 degrees, it's a failure. If you're trying to get, I think I quoted one person last year saying, if you're trying to get to New York and you only get to New Jersey, you have failed. And you have a lot of people who call themselves climate realists, who say exactly what you're describing, that what's really important is not setting expectations too high, being realistic that the targets that will be delivered for Paris won't keep temperatures below 2 degrees, but as long as you create a framework, create an architecture where countries don't backslide, do keep increasing ambition, and we do bend the curve, that's what's important. I think one of the stories to watch is almost a PR story. We heard a lot of, for years, since Copenhagen, we've been hearing that expectations were too high in Copenhagen, and that was part of the problem. I'm still not hearing from, the UNFCCC, from a lot of leaders, what their message is on 2 degrees. Do they expect, I think a lot of them know that it won't, but nobody's really out there saying, look, please don't think this is a failure. if come December 10th, we have, or December 20th, who knows how long this one will go. Yeah, if by December 12th we only get to New Jersey, this is they're saying things like this is a longer haul. Climate is a marathon, not a sprint, but no one is really being very clear yet, I think, and maybe it's a question of not wanting to set expectations too low, but about how to set the bar of failure or success in Paris.
I guess it depends on where you start from. Is it Washington, D.C. or Washington State?
Right. So, but the bottom line for Mr. Brooks then is no new real relevance, but do watch the path.
I have one thing to add, and on science, if that makes any interest anyone. In Brazil, Brazil, as many of you know, is now producing as much, if not more, soybeans than the U.S., and their expansion of their soybean production in order to raise feed for cattle that more people in Asia are being able to afford for the first time is really driving that. So this, looking at these global interconnections and population growth and this new rise in the middle class and continuing to look at these interconnections, I think will be even more critical this year than in the past. But also, one of the things that I think we will be seeing on the science end of things is the connection that the people in Brazil are actually seeing. There's a new project. They had a meeting here. That's how I learned about it. The FAPESP, the Sao Paulo Main Science Academy, and the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy, is looking at the ways where over the Amazon that the moisture level is changing. So they're having droughts in some of the breadbasket areas of Brazil. That's big, and I think is completely undercovered. The research is not all out, but the fact that they are monitoring it and have an increased level of effort on that is something to watch and to see what the results they'll be publishing in the next year. I'm going to be following that story.
Let's go to the back of the room. How about the second from the last row, 4 in your gray top?
Hi, my name's Jennifer Dixon, and I'm with the Wilderness Society. So you've talked a little bit about the EPA and renewable energy a bit, but one agency we haven't talked about is the Department of Interior. And in 2014, we saw one of the world's largest solar facilities go online just across the Nevada border in California. We see industrial scale renewables increasing. I'm curious how you see efforts from the Department of Interior, and especially around renewable energy and meeting the President's goals, playing into your coverage of climate and energy issues over the next year.
Anybody?
Well, I think the renewable energy agenda of the administration is certainly continues. I think the Interior Department just made an announcement just the other day on that in New Mexico. So it's certainly part of the equation. I don't see it as big a part of my coverage as it was in the first part of the administration. I think that's due to a couple of reasons. One, because the Stimulus Act of 2009 really jump-started and gave a lot of money to that effort, and that money has really dried up. Secondly, the oil and natural gas boom has really taken a lot of everybody's attention. It's taken a lot of my attention. I cover the oil and gas boom more than I cover renewables. That's not because I don't like renewables. I don't like oil and gas either. I'm agnostic on the energy source, but it's a really big story right now, and it's also taking a lot of time within the administration. I mean, the Interior Secretary was in New Mexico talking about methane from the oil and gas sector. It has a methane rule coming out on public land. So I think it certainly continues to be something that the administration supports, though it's not as big as it was in the beginning.
The other interesting thing about the Interior Department and various other things that the Obama administration is doing is the fact that, Obama has put forward these climate targets, and as I mentioned before, what's happening on agriculture. Like, our attention is focused on certain things, but there are other things that seem to be going on in various other realms and various other agencies that seem to undercut this mission that he stated. So, for example, the leasing of Powder River Basin coal at low prices that the Inspector General of the Interior Department also said is enormously problematic, where that's for both domestic consumption and is also exported, right? So to me, BLM is interesting that way because I feel like there are different parts of the Obama administration whose activities seem to run counter to the mission he stated. And to me as a reporter, that's quite interesting.
And I think you're going to see less and less of that. I mean, the Council on Environmental Quality a few weeks ago released some draft guidance. It's not a regulation, but it's guidance, and it's important guidance, telling agencies, including the Interior Department, to include climate change as part of regular National Environmental Policy Act reviews, and that will only help renewable energy much more compared to fossil fuel projects.
How about we come down to the middle? The black coat with the green scarf in the middle there. Bluish. Sorry, turquoise.
Hi, I'm Dara Kodavala, and I also work with Jeremy Brooks at EPA. I'm a student contractor, though I don't represent them as he is. And I'm a PhD student at Arizona State, affiliated also with CISPO, Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. We've talked about the role that science has in this, politics has in this. What about journalism in terms of framing what we do next? Often newsworthiness is framed as conflict. What about the idea of these oblique angles, role models? Where do we go from here? Could you speak to the role of journalists in understanding our future as a species?
So,
I'm sorry, was that too broad a question?
No. Del, you should start on this one because you do some of the great sort of looks every year at, who's covering climate change, right? And how deeply.
Yes. It's funny because I wanted to. We got a question in from Twitter that I would like to also maybe roll into this, if I may. It's just kind of who are the key voices to watch for shifting opinion. This comes from Daniel Melling. Who are the key voices to watch for shifting opinion on climate and energy issues? So, Lisa's right. We do. We aggregate a lot of voices and mainstream media on climate change, environmental health. I've been looking most recently over the past 6 years at how climate coverage has changed, and we have definitely, our aggregation is imperfect. We don't grab everything. It's just a selective group. A selective subset of the coverage, but that subset hasn't changed. Our standards haven't changed very much, and you can definitely see an upswing in 2014. Over coverage, and it's continuing. It's going to. I will predict I'll buy lunch if it doesn't continue to climb. Given Paris, given everything that's good, this fight between Congress and Obama and the ozone rules, the carbon rules. We're going to see a lot more coverage on the environment in 2015. I would bet than we saw in 2014. The nadir was in 2012, 2011 when we were at the kind of bottoming out from the recession, and we're back up to the peaks where we saw in 2009, 2008 when you had the Copenhagen Hope and Al Gore out there with his video. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question there, but it we're seeing a rebound in coverage for sure.
Well, but how long? Washington Post just restarted a new big environment.
Yeah.
New York Times is boosting its coverage. Just in terms of numbers, again, I think you're right. You're starting to see a bit of a resurgence.
Well, except the question is, how long is that going to last, right?
Definitely.
No, seriously, is it going to last past, as somebody who came from traditional media and I'm now at, this sort of, boutique shop, right? How long is it going to last? Is it going to last past Paris? And right now, to me, what's driving it is the nexus of politics and policy, because when it's just policy, people really don't care, and editors really don't care. If it doesn't have who's up and who's down in politics, or if it doesn't have the bang bang of national security, not climate change is really depressing. What dirge are you going to sing today about the planet, right? It's sort of totally depressing, and so it's a hard sell, and editors will come pat you in the back and say you've got the most important beat in the paper, the existential crisis, and then you have to. It has to have some kind of political angle for there to be coverage. And I think that is the issue. And I think what is going to make it the issue is if we start, I hate to say it, but it's going to be suffering, right? If things start hitting us, if we have Sandys, if we have droughts, that's what gets you into traditional media. Now, one interesting thing that I think is happening is the emergence of, we're tiny. Inside Climate is tiny, but there's there's like Vice, there's Vox, there's Matter, there are all of these new things coming up for a younger generation that is more accepting of the science of climate change. And there's no question that they accept the science, right? And they're doing very interesting work on it. And I think there will be some very interesting shifts in that space. And that's, watch them. Watch us too, but watch them, right?
Well, I also think that yes, there is a little bit of a fatigue over reading a climate story all the time, and I think that you'll be seeing some shifts. One, I just received notice at the Solutions Journalism Network, solutions.org or something. I'm not sure what the website is, but this is a resource for journalists. They had just published a new I don't know if it's a manual or some sort of, way to report solutions stories. It's a way to critically look at some of these solutions that are being put forward and how to work with an editor on that and providing a critical investigation of it, looking at, and provides you with some guidelines. And I think it's a new way to approach these stories that we all have to examine, because there are solutions being put out there, but are we really addressing them critically or not? And the other thing is, I believe that the story will be changing and with this interconnection piece, because it won't just be climate change. You're going to be seeing a lot more things on biodiversity. You'll be seeing a lot more of the connections between the population, or what are the stressing points that humans are putting on our critical natural resources, and that will be part of the discussion.
So I think also getting to the issue of the role of journalists and the role of journalism, all this. It also depends obviously on who your audience is. There was a question just before about coverage of renewable energy development on public lands and the role of the Department of Interior. That's an issue we cover in detail, whether it's offshore wind facilities or other development. And audience for my publications is business, a regulated industry. They are very interested in policy. They are very interested in regulation, what EPA is doing, and so forth. So it really depends on who your audience is, what your mission is. Are you more of advocacy journalism? Are you just trying to provide information? What's your role and sort of, what your audience is, I think drives a lot of what journalism will do in this area.
And I think that's where one of the big bright spots is in environmental journalism. Like Neela was saying, there's so many more outlets out there. There's outlets like ENE, where I work, and BNA that, we can do the deep dives on policy. We can do, 8 different stories on the US-China deal from, looking at it from every angle, and our readers will eat that up. To general, population newspapers where people will read 1 or 2 stories about climate change, every couple months, and you need to make it, you need to hit them in the heart. To all of these really interesting online magazines that are doing great things with maps and taking video, taking content, putting things in a context that that we can't do sometimes in our publications. To me, that's a really exciting thing. Who to watch? Kate Shepard's Twitter account has a great list of energy and environment journalists to watch, which I'm going to give a shout out to, because she just compiled a big old list of them, which are great.
I also think it's important to remember that while everybody in this room really cares about this issue, I would say most people, generally speaking, do not care about it, and that's a challenge. I think Neela touched on it. As somebody who works for a primarily business paper, we might not write about the big report on climate change. There are too many reports on climate change, I think, and they all run together. And I don't cover almost all of them because they don't actually change things. They're not, one report by itself is not going to change the narrative. And while altruism and stewardship of the planet are good causes to act on climate change, I don't think you're going to get there without some sort of concrete business incentive to do it. For example, CCS is primarily a good business decision when you are using it to get oil out of the ground, and I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, my blunt metric for looking at public attitudes is the degree of bodily harm to which my readers want to subject me when I write about climate. I now can actually survive to live another day. So I haven't gotten the death threat in quite some time. So I think we may be on the cusp of a new renaissance.
Well, let me. Any others that we should? Let me go back to Daniel Mellings. I mean, Lisa, that was a good suggestion there. I'd have to heartily endorse that one. Kate Shepard. Who are any other key voices out there? Neela, you mentioned Vox and some of those newer publications.
But that's media, but if Daniel is asking more broadly, like who are the messengers to watch? I mean, I think there are social scientists who are trying to and scientists too, who are trying to crack that question, because it's, something I alluded to earlier, is that it's really about the messenger, and it's this notion that we've become so tribalized because of various trends over the last 30 or 40 years that it's really hard for us to accept information without our filters keeping out important things. So, for example, at Yale, like somebody like Tony Leiserowitz is working on a project of identifying the messenger. So where do people mostly get their information? Like, people associate climate with weather, right? So where do people mostly get their information about weather? Well, from their local meteorologists. So there are meteorologists. A lot of them are climate contrarians, but there are people who would like to talk about climate change when they're talking about like crazy weather swings, but they don't have the science to do that. So you have social scientists like Tony Leiserowitz, Ed Maybach, and others. Ed Maybach said George Mason, who are working with these people. So these are not people who are household names, right? And sometimes, in fact, I think it backfires, like when you have a Leo DiCaprio or Robert Redford associated, because then it seems like some kind of frivolous issue that jet-setting stars, who are emitting carbon, are involved in. But if it's sort of trusted people who are involved in this, then I think it's interesting. One little interesting thing to watch as far as like the message getting through. Two things happened in West Virginia this week. I don't know if you guys noticed this. One, for those people who want more renewables, they repealed part of their renewable standards. But for people concerned about like the message getting through, they were supposed to change their science standards to take out mention of climate, and families fought back against that, and they actually got, a decent sort of science-based approach to climate change to stand. So something is clearly getting through.
I think for the last couple of years, we've been on, polarizing sides of this debate. Without naming names, I would suggest people look to the middle for ideas on how to go forward.
Fair enough. How about the gentleman in the tannish shirt right in the middle there? Is that gray, tan? It's Lord.
It's definitely gray.
All right.
I thought it was tan myself.
So I wanted to ask about something that Randy had said earlier about how whenever some controversy kicks up, everyone always ends up saying the same thing, and it can become very predictable to cover climate or environmental issues in general. So I'm curious to hear from your coverage or just from your experiences talking with people in industry or activist groups or agencies, do you see that dynamic changing at all? Do you see that agencies maybe are feeling a little more empowered to push a rule forward? Or do you see that, corporate pressure has the same impact it always has? Or do you see that, it just matters who's president and that's really the bottom line? Or, what will happen to that after the next presidential election? Do you feel like agencies are maybe feeling like the science is on their side and maybe public opinion is swinging more in their direction, that they should feel free to push a little harder next time? Or, is that going to be a story worth watching?
I definitely think EPA feels much more empowered now than it did a couple of years ago. I don't anticipate Gina McCarthy having Obama pull back the ozone rule at the surprise of everyone. So I think EPA is very empowered, especially with some top White House officials who cover the energy and climate space leaving. I think a lot of that is going to be falling on Gina McCarthy. So I think they certainly feel more empowered. And I think the entire administration does, because it's in the last 2 years. And in terms of conflicts, and I'm personally very sick of writing the same story on Keystone over and over again. And I think most people don't care about that pipeline anymore, from a business perspective especially. TransCanada obviously does, but most people have moved on.
How about in the center with the check scarf? Yes. Houndstooth. No. Chevron.
Chevron.
These things.
Stripes. Anyway, Marcia Johnston. I do freelancing for Modern Farmer and Biocycle, and I had a question for Lisa or anybody else who has experience with it. I always get it wrong, the pesticides, the ones that, and I was curious if you had any sense of the latest research, because when I talk to beekeepers and farmers, there's not really any doubt about what's killing them. So they believe that it really is. So I'm curious what the latest research you see is. And also if you've seen any innovative solutions, like something to replace them.
I don't think I have but I know somebody who is here in the audience who could probably speak to you on that. So
Maybe you guys could connect afterwards.
yes.
But maybe, what is the role? Do you? I mean, this is maybe a little far from some of our expertise about some of the pesticides, some of the replacements. We haven't really talked a lot about environmental health. I mean, maybe it's not our bailiwick here, but with bisphenol A and some of those replacements chemicals, is that going to be? Do people care? As much?
I think people care a lot about that, but I think the question is, what is EPA doing about it? It's IRIS. Its efforts to look at the effects of chemicals and to classify them as hazardous or not is terribly lagging, and it has for a long time. And so, I think to step back, it's interesting. I think people assume, and I think I did too, before I started on this beat, that we have an environmental regulator, so everything's cool, right? Like we're protected, and you realize you're not. And so I think people are very concerned about environmental health, but they assume that EPA's got it, and they don't. And I think as journalists and as people in industry and as citizens, the question becomes, why don't they? Like, where is this lag, right? In research, in designations, in funding, and all of that.
And also, they're needing to get stronger and stronger chemicals out there to be able to be effective, because things are becoming more resistant to it. And even I was talking last week to a farmer in South America who is troubled by, and I've written quite a bit about this, about the red rice, the weedy rice in the fields, and having to buy a new kind of rice seed called Clearfield in order to be able to grow rice again in that field, because a field is completely useless to him otherwise. But even those new seeds he's found, which are supposed to be able to provide, resistance against the it's a little bit complicated, but be able to grow in the field again, he's not able to get the same yields out of those anymore, and they're not becoming less effective. So, our best innovations are becoming less effective. That's a problem, and that's why I'm covering this beat and learning. So I'm getting up to speed on a lot of the issues that you're talking about. But the research that I'm following, I keep chasing, because it seems to be that one answer, and then we don't have the regulation for it, or it's not regulated well, and we don't know the answers to everything. And that's the problem here, because what we need to have now is a lot of the innovations happening, and there aren't a lot of research dollars spent behind finding the answers to it, and coming down the pike with who knows what's going to happen with funding for that research.
I think also with regard to chemicals like BPAs, for the non-agricultural chemicals, certainly I would think there's more of a concern among certain parts of the population. For example, parents with young children. The whole issue of BPA, you see baby bottles and other things. You don't. And sometimes you see water bottles and so forth that are BPA free, but it's certainly an issue that seems to resonate more with people with infants and young children. Also, with the rise in certain developmental disorders, it's becoming an issue. What are the causes of these? Are they chemicals in the environment? Are there other causes, and so forth? But one of the key issues which will have to be addressed is, have things like BPA, perfluorinated chemicals, the Teflon chemical, other things. You say, okay, we're going to get some alternative, but are you testing the alternative sufficiently? Is that pose dangers that may even be worse than the chemical you're replacing? And the issue for some becomes, do you even need the chemical in the first place? There's a dry cleaning chemical that's used. Can you clean your clothes, do dry clean without the chemical? Can you use other processes? So it's not just replacing one chemical with another, which may have its own risks, probably does have some risks, but maybe thinking of other ways to fulfill the same objective that are non-chemical potentially.
And people in the audience may know this better than I because I haven't really researched it, but I keep hearing about it, is that I guess the Europeans, the EU, has instituted a different system whereby if you're introducing chemicals into the market, it's on you as the company to show that they're safe, right? In the US, it's the opposite, that the assumption is that these chemicals are safe until a regulator proves otherwise. Now, if the regulator doesn't have the funding or the expertise or the staffing to do that, then the advantage lies with the company and not necessarily with the consumer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I won't bet lunch on it, but I this issue of replacements. What is BPA-free mean? Could be an issue to watch in 2015. We have time for one last question, but before we do so, I would like to give Megan Parker, she has a few last words for us, and before she starts, I would like to remind you guys that if you enjoy this kind of a conversation, join us in Oklahoma. Join the Society of Environmental Journalists at the National Conference in Oklahoma this October, or in Sacramento in 2016. You can see more information at scj.org. And Megan, a word.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm eager to hear the last question. If you enjoyed this as well and you want to watch it again, the webcast will be available immediately afterwards. You can share that as well with other people who weren't able to attend. There will also be a short video version that our AV team is going to put together. We will have both SE Journal and the New Security Beat will have wrap-ups of this event that you can share with folks. And if you would like to come back to the Wilson Center, please sign up for event invitations. And I would like to thank both the SCJ board members, many of whom are here today, and please take a chance to talk to them at the reception, as well as our hardworking team here at the center, particularly but not limited to Kate Diamond, who somehow manages to tweet and troubleshoot at the same time. I don't know how she does that. And as well to our generous reception sponsors, Bloomberg BNA, Resource Media, Earth Justice, Environmental Law Institute, the Canada Institute, and the Science and Technology Program. And now, who gets the last question?
Who gets the last question? How about the black turtleneck in the back, third row? Yes, that's you.
Talk to my wife about male color blindness.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Rona Cobell, and I write for the Chesapeake Bay Journal. So as you can imagine, in the Chesapeake Bay, we're steeped in manure. So the question I have goes to the point that Neela made earlier about ag being untouchable. And I'm wondering if, given the recent events in Iowa with the water company in Iowa suing over phosphorus and the algae blooms in Lake Erie in Ohio and those affecting the water supply, if now we're in a situation where we have to choose which is more important, big ag or our water supply, and if you still think, given recent events, that ag is still untouchable.
Excellent
Thank
question.
you.
Yes, I do. I mean, it's people want to get reelected. They want money. They don't want to be excoriated. And it's an interesting thing, right? So, if you go after quote unquote big oil, right? There's some states that produce oil and gas, some states don't. But if you go after ag, every state has farmers, right? And even though most of us know that that the family farm is largely a thing of the past, and farming has gotten more and more consolidated, and you have major industrial enterprises running, that there's this notion of that you're going after the humble salt of the earth family farmer with these onerous regulations and ruining his or her life, and they're barely making it, and so on. And it's this is lots of things will occur. I don't know how much more needs to occur. I mean, but I don't think that right now we have hit that critical mass where you're actually going to see the federal government step in and take a closer look at ag and find better ways to regulate it.
I think EPA has found out how difficult the ag community can be with this Waters of the U.S. rule. I think it has admitted it didn't roll out that regulation very well and is trying to correct itself there. On your point about methane, even though agriculture industry has the biggest share of methane emissions in the U.S., I was on a call with Jack Gerard, the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, and he was saying, he's like, we're not even the biggest contributor of methane. We don't think we should be regulated. Stop singling us out. And when somebody says don't single us out, well, then I'm like, well, do you think other industries, i.e. ag, should be regulated? And he's like, well, no, we would never think that. So even when you have...
I won't touch ag.
Right.
Whoa.
So I don't think, especially this EPA has its hands full on what it's already doing.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we were covering a disastrous explosion of a fertilizer plant in Texas that killed a whole bunch of folks on a Wednesday or Tuesday evening. And one of the pushbacks that we got from our stories on the danger of this stuff when it's not properly managed was that this was an attack on agriculture, because agriculture could not survive without ammonium nitrate fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. So that, of course, reminded people of just how ingrained that idea is, even when it blows up and kills a bunch of people.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming here. I want to thank the panelists for being here, and thank you. And I know I couldn't get to all the questions, but we'll be here for the reception afterwards. Everyone's invited to the reception. Thank you again to all our sponsors, and Megan and Carolyn for having such a great group here together.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody dying.
Yeah, isn't that great?